This millionaire on the brink of death asked George Strait for something, and what happened will surprise you. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Mitchell's office hummed with an indifference that made James Harrington's stomach turn. He sat in the leather chair across from the oncologist's desk, his calloused hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The words coming from the doctor's mouth seemed to bounce off the walls, refusing to penetrate his consciousness. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Metastasized. Inoperable. 3 months, maybe 4 if he was lucky. Lucky. James almost laughed at the irony. Here he was, 78 years old, sitting on a fortune worth $3.2 billion, and the universe had just handed him an eviction notice with no possibility of appeal. He had built his empire one property at a time, starting with a rundown duplex in South Austin 46 years ago, working 18-hour days, missing birthdays and anniversaries, sacrificing everything on the altar of success. And for what? So he could sit in this sterile office and hear that none of it mattered anymore. Dr. Mitchell was still talking, his mouth moving in that practiced way doctors have when they deliver devastating news multiple times a day. Something about treatment options, palliative care, quality of life. James heard none of it. His mind had traveled back to a sweltering summer day in 1977 when he had laid the first brick of his first development project with his own hands. His wife Martha had been there, 7 months pregnant with their son Daniel, holding an umbrella over his head to shield him from the Texas sun. She had believed in him when no bank would give him a loan, when his own father called him a fool for leaving his stable job at the insurance company. Martha. God, he missed her. 15 years since breast cancer had taken her, and the wound still felt fresh. At least she would not have to watch him deteriorate, would not have to see the mighty James Harrington reduced to a hollow shell in a hospital bed. He wondered if he would see her again, wherever she was. He had never been a particularly religious man, but in this moment he found himself hoping the preachers were right about something waiting on the other side. Mr. Harrington? James? Dr. Mitchell's voice finally broke through the fog. Do you have any questions for me? James looked up at the young doctor, probably not even 40 years old, his whole life stretching out before him like an endless highway. What questions could he possibly have? How do you ask someone to explain why the universe is so cruel? How do you inquire about the fairness of working your entire life only to have it cut short just when you finally had time to enjoy it? No, James said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. No questions. He stood up, his 6'2" frame still imposing despite his age, and walked out of the office without another word. His driver, Marcus, was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against the black Mercedes. The young man straightened up when he saw James emerge from the building, and something in his employer's expression made him swallow whatever greeting he had been about to offer. The drive back to the estate in Westlake Hills was silent. James stared out the window at the Austin skyline, at the buildings he had helped shape, the developments that bore his architectural vision. The city had transformed during his lifetime from a sleepy college town into a booming metropolis, and he had been part of that transformation. His buildings would outlast him. The thought should have brought comfort, but instead it felt hollow, like reading your own obituary in advance. When they pulled through the gates of his property, James noticed Daniel's car in the driveway. His son had probably heard about the doctor's appointment. Daniel had been calling more frequently lately, ever since James had mentioned feeling tired all the time, since the jaundice had appeared. His son was a good man, vice president of Harrington Development now, married with 3 children of his own, but there was a distance between them that James knew was his own fault, built brick by brick, through decades of missed soccer games and forgotten recitals, through choosing board meetings over birthday parties. If you are watching this story unfold and finding yourself moved by James's journey, we would love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what this story means to you. Your thoughts and presence here mean the world to us, and we read every single comment. Now let us continue with James's story. Marcus opened the car door, but James did not immediately get out. He sat there looking at his mansion, at the 10,000 square foot monument to his success. 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a wine cellar he never used, a home theater where he watched movies alone. What was the point of any of it? Mr. Harrington, Marcus said gently, would you like me to tell Mr. Daniel you need some time? James shook his head. No, let him in. Might as well get it over with. He climbed out of the car, and walked up the stone pathway to his front door. Inside, Daniel was waiting in the foyer, pacing back and forth in that nervous way he had inherited from his mother. When he saw his father, he stopped, his face a mixture of hope and dread. "Dad," Daniel said, "what did Dr. Mitchell say?" James walked past his son toward the study, the one room in this massive house that felt like it was actually his. The walls were lined with leather-bound books he had never read, the shelves displaying awards and photographs from 4 decades of business success. He poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter on the sidebar, something he rarely did before evening, and downed it in one swallow. "Dad, you are scaring me," Daniel pressed. "Oh, please, just tell me what he said." James poured another drink and turned to face his son. In the afternoon light streaming through the windows, he could see Martha in Daniel's features, the same green eyes, the same slight upturn of the nose. How had this man gotten to be 43 years old? It seemed like just yesterday he was a boy asking his father to play catch in the backyard, a request James had been too busy to honor, more often than not. "Pancreatic cancer," James said flatly. "Stage 4. 3 months? Maybe 4. The color drained from Daniel's face. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. No, that cannot be right. You should get a second opinion, a third opinion. We can fly to MD Anderson in Houston, to Sloan Kettering in New York. Dad, you have the resources to get the best care in the world." "The best care in the world cannot fix this," James said, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "Dr. Mitchell was very clear. It has spread to my liver, my lungs. Surgery is not an option. Chemotherapy might buy me a few weeks, but the quality of life would be terrible. I'm not interested in spending my last days vomiting in a hospital bed." Daniel sank into the chair, his head in his hands. His shoulders began to shake, and James realized his son was crying. When was the last time he had seen Daniel cry? At Martha's funeral, probably. James felt like he should go to him, put a hand on his shoulder, offer some comfort. But he had never been good at that sort of thing, and he did not know how to start now. "I am sorry, son," James said, and he meant it. Sorry for the cancer, yes, but sorry for so much more. Sorry for all the ways he had failed as a father, for prioritizing deals over relationships, for teaching Daniel that success was measured in dollars rather than moments. Daniel looked up, his eyes red. "What are you going to do?" It was a good question. What do you do when you are handed an expiration date? James had spent the entire drive home thinking about exactly that. He could spend his remaining time getting his affairs in order, making sure Daniel and the grandchildren were provided for. But his lawyers had already handled most of that years ago. He could travel, see the world, check items off some bucket list, but the thought of dragging his deteriorating body through airports and hotels held no appeal. No, there was only one thing James truly wanted to do with his remaining time. One experience that felt essential, that felt like it might actually bring him peace. He wanted to hear George Strait sing, live, one more time. Not in some arena surrounded by thousands of strangers, but intimately, the way music was meant to be heard. "I am going to listen to some music," James said. Daniel looked confused. "What?" James moved to his desk and sat down heavily in the leather chair. "George Strait. I want to hear him sing. I'm going to arrange a private concert." "George Strait," Daniel repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Then something shifted in his expression, a memory surfacing. "You used to play his albums when I was a kid, in the truck, driving to construction sites." James nodded. It was one of the few memories they shared, those early Saturday mornings when Daniel was young, before the business had consumed James completely. He would take his son along to check on various projects, and they would drive through Austin as the sun came up, George Strait's voice filling the cab of his old Ford pickup. Those were good mornings, simple mornings, before everything got so complicated. "His music has been with me through everything," James said quietly. "When I built my first development, when your mother and I were living in that tiny apartment, and I was terrified I would fail, when she got sick, when she died. George Strait's voice was there, helping me make sense of things. Then we will make it happen," Daniel said, straightening up, his business training kicking in even through his grief. "Whatever it costs, however we need to arrange it, we will make it happen." For the first time since leaving Dr. Mitchell's office, James felt something other than numbness. It was not quite hope, but it was close. A sense of purpose, however small. He had 3 months to live, maybe 4. He was going to spend at least one of those days listening to the man whose music had been the soundtrack to his life. Over the next week, James withdrew from the world. He stopped going to the office, stopped taking calls from business associates and old friends. He spent his days in the study, listening to George Strait albums on vinyl, reading, and occasionally staring out the window at the hills of Texas that he loved. Daniel came by every day, usually with James's grandchildren, trying to coax his father back into engagement with life. But James found he preferred the solitude, the quiet space to reflect on what his life had been and what little remained of it. Meanwhile, Daniel and Marcus worked on making the impossible happen. They reached out to George Strait's management company, explaining the situation, offering whatever sum was necessary for a private performance. The initial responses were polite but firm. Mr. Strait was on a break from touring, spending time at his ranch, and did not do private concerts regardless of the compensation offered. Daniel increased the offer. $1 million, $2 million, $5 million. The answer remained the same. George Strait was not for sale, no matter the price. It was frustrating for Daniel, who had grown up in his father's world where money solved problems, where enough zeros on a check opened any door. But apparently this door was locked, and no amount of wealth could pick it. James took the news with surprising calm when Daniel reported it on the 8th day. They were sitting on the back terrace, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. James had lost weight, Daniel noticed. His father's clothes hung looser, and there was a yellowish tint to his skin that had not been there a week ago. It was a long shot anyway, James said, taking a sip of iced tea. His appetite had disappeared, but he forced himself to drink, to maintain some semblance of normal routine. "I am not giving up," Daniel insisted. "There has to be a way." James smiled sadly at his son's determination. It reminded him of himself at that age, convinced that will and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Life had a way of teaching you otherwise, but he appreciated Daniel's refusal to accept defeat. That night, alone in his study with only the glow of his desk lamp for company, James made a decision. If money could not buy him what he wanted, maybe honesty could. He had spent his entire life playing his cards close to his vest, never showing weakness, never asking for help. What did he have to lose now? He pulled out his phone and opened the video camera. His hands shook slightly, whether from emotion or the disease he could not tell. He positioned the phone on his desk, propped against a stack of books, and pressed record. For a long moment he just stared at the camera, unsure where to begin. How do you condense a lifetime of meaning into a few minutes? How do you explain to a stranger what their art has meant to you without sounding desperate or pathetic? But then he remembered Dr. Mitchell's office, remembered the feeling of powerlessness, and he realized he had nothing left to protect, no image to maintain, no pride to preserve. "Mr. Strait," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "my name is James Harrington. You do not know me, and I have no right to ask anything of you. But I am going to ask anyway because I have run out of options, and, quite frankly, I have run out of time." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The words came easier than he expected, flowing from some deep place he had kept locked away for decades. 3 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors tell me I have maybe 3 months left, probably less. I have spent the last week trying to figure out what to do with whatever time remains, and I keep coming back to the same answer. I want to hear you sing, one last time, not in an arena or on a recording, but live, in person, the way music is supposed to be experienced. James leaned forward, his eyes locked on the camera lens, as if he could see George Strait through it. "I am not going to tell you I am a good man who deserves this. The truth is, I have spent most of my life being a mediocre husband and a worse father. I built buildings instead of relationships. I accumulated wealth instead of memories. But through all of it, through the long nights and the hard decisions and the moments when I did not think I could keep going, your music was there. It was not just background noise. It was a lifeline." He told the story of that first development, of Martha holding the umbrella, of driving through Austin at dawn with Daniel, George Strait on the radio. He talked about the album he played on repeat the night Martha died, how the lyrics to "I Can Still Make Cheyenne" somehow captured the regret of a life spent chasing the wrong things. He spoke for nearly 5 minutes, his voice breaking occasionally, but never stopping. "I know you do not do private concerts," James concluded. "I know my people have already reached out and been told no. I understand that. A man in your position probably gets requests like this every day. But I am asking anyway, not because I think my money makes me special, but because I am hoping my honesty might. I am not asking for much, just an hour of your time, just a few songs, just one moment of beauty before everything goes dark." He reached forward and stopped the recording. His hands were trembling worse now, and he felt exhausted, as if that 5-minute confession had drained whatever energy he had left. He watched the video back once, wincing at how old and frail he looked, at the desperation in his voice. For a moment, he considered deleting it, preserving his dignity, going to his grave without having begged anyone for anything. But then he thought about those mornings with Daniel, about Martha's smile, about all the moments he had missed because he was too proud or too busy or too afraid to be vulnerable. Dignity was a cold companion. He had learned that lesson too late for most things, but maybe not too late for this. He sent the video to Daniel with a simple message: "Send this to George Strait's team. If they still say no, at least I tried." Daniel received the video at 11:30 that night. He was in bed next to his wife Rebecca, unable to sleep, his mind churning through possibilities and impossibilities. When his phone buzzed and he saw the message from his father, he grabbed his headphones and went into the bathroom so he would not wake Rebecca. Watching his father's confession broke something open in Daniel's chest. He had never heard his father speak like that, had never seen him so raw and unguarded. The James Harrington he knew was all stone and steel, a man who viewed emotion as weakness and vulnerability as failure. This man on the screen, this dying man asking for one last gift, was someone Daniel barely recognized, and yet somehow knew better than the father he had grown up with. When the video ended, Daniel sat on the bathroom floor and cried. He cried for his father's illness, for all the years they had lost to James's ambition, for the grandfather his children would barely remember. But he also cried because, in some strange way, this video was the most honest conversation he had ever had with his dad. At 1 in the morning, Daniel forwarded the video to George Strait's management company with a subject line that read simply, "Please watch this." Then he sent it to the publicist they had been working with and to 2 other contacts in the country music industry that various business associates had provided. He did not include any additional message, no renewed offers of payment, no pressure. The video would speak for itself, or it would not speak at all. What Daniel did not know was that his father's video would not stay private for long. The publicist at George Strait's management company, a woman named Kelly Richardson who had worked in the music industry for 23 years, was so moved by James's message that she showed it to her husband over breakfast the next morning. Her husband, a music blogger with a modest but dedicated following, asked if he could share it. Kelly knew she should not. The video was sent privately, meant only for George Strait and his team. But something about James Harrington's story felt bigger than privacy concerns. She made her husband promise to remove any contact information and to be respectful in how he presented it. Then she gave him permission. The video went live on the blog at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday with a simple headline, "A dying man's last wish, please help him meet George Strait." Within 2 hours, it had been shared 800 times. By evening, it was on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. By the next morning, it had been picked up by local news stations in Texas. By that afternoon, it was national news. James knew nothing about any of this. He spent those days in a morphine-tinged haze, the pain medication Dr. Mitchell had prescribed, making the hours blur together. Daniel tried to explain what was happening, how the video had gone viral, how people all over the country were sharing James's story and pleading with George Strait to grant his wish. But James could not quite grasp it, could not understand why strangers would care about an old man's dying request. The hashtag #Strait4James began trending on Twitter. Country music fans from Nashville to Los Angeles were posting their own stories about what George Strait's music meant to them, creating a groundswell of emotional support for a man they had never met. Music journalists wrote think pieces about the power of art to sustain us through our darkest moments. Morning talk shows debated whether celebrities had an obligation to respond to requests like James's. George Strait himself was at his ranch outside San Antonio, intentionally disconnected from social media and news cycles, when his daughter Jennifer called him. Not his late daughter Jennifer, who had died in the accident, but his living daughter, whom he had named in honor of her sister, now 35 years old and living in Nashville. "Dad," she said without preamble, Have you seen the video?" "What video?" George was in his barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. "A man named James Harrington. He is dying of cancer and his last wish is to hear you sing. Dad, the whole country is talking about it. The whole country is asking you to help him." George felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the one that always appeared when he was confronted with death and loss. "Jennifer, you know I do not do private concerts. If I did it for one person, I would have to do it for everyone who asks." "I know, Dad, but you should watch the video. Just watch it." That evening, after the mare had settled and the ranch hands had gone home, George sat in his study and pulled up the video on his computer. He had been in the music business for over 40 years. He had seen every kind of fan, received every kind of request. He had developed thick skin and clear boundaries, necessary armor for anyone who wanted to maintain sanity in the spotlight. But watching James Harrington's confession stripped away that armor. George saw himself in the older man's face, saw the weight of regret and the burden of time squandered. He heard echoes of his own grief in James's voice when he talked about losing his wife to cancer. And when James spoke about those early mornings driving through Austin with his son, George thought about his own children, about how close he had come to losing everything to his career before the tragedy of Jennifer's death had reset his priorities. George watched the video 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and called his manager, a man named Tom who had been with him for 30 years. "Tom," George said, "that video everyone is talking about, James Harrington, do we have his contact information?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We do. You want me to send him something, maybe a signed guitar or a personal message?" "No," George said quietly. "I want his phone number. I'm going to call him myself." Tom was silent for a long moment. "George, if you do this, you know what is going to happen. Every dying person in America is going to want the same thing. Every charity, every cause. You will open a door you cannot close." "Maybe that door should have been open all along," George replied. "Get me his number, Tom." It was 8:30 on a Friday evening when James's phone rang. He was in his study, dozing in his chair, an old photograph album open on his lap. Daniel had brought it over earlier, a collection of pictures from James's construction days, from family vacations and holidays. Looking through it had been bittersweet, a reminder of all the moments James had been physically present for, but emotionally absent from. The phone's ringtone startled him awake. He fumbled for it on the side table, squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen. His first instinct was to ignore it, probably a telemarketer or a wrong number. But something made him answer. "Hello?" His voice was thick with sleep and medication. "Mr. Harrington, this is George Strait." James's grip on the phone tightened. For a moment, he thought he must be dreaming, that the morphine had conjured this voice he knew so well. "I'm sorry, who?" "George Strait, sir. I saw your video. I would like to talk to you about your request, if you have a few minutes." The room seemed to tilt. James sat up straighter in his chair, the photo album sliding to the floor. "Mr. Strait, I do not know what to say. I never imagined you would actually see that video, much less respond to it." "Well, I did see it," George said warmly. "And I was moved by it, James. May I call you James?" "Of course, yes, please. I want to hear more about your story, James. Not the dying part, not the part about wanting to hear me sing. I want to know about you, about Martha, about those mornings with your son." And so James talked. For nearly an hour he told George Strait things he had never told anyone, stories about his life that he had kept locked away, because successful men were not supposed to dwell on feelings or admit to failures. He talked about the guilt of missing Daniel's childhood, about the hole Martha's death had left in his world, about the strange clarity that comes with knowing your days are numbered. George listened without interrupting, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried its own weight of experience. "James, I lost my daughter Jennifer when she was 13 years old. Car accident. One moment she was here, the next she was gone. It broke something in me that never quite healed, changed everything about how I saw life, how I made decisions, made me realize that all the success in the world does not mean anything if you are not present for the people you love." James felt tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, I cannot imagine that kind of loss." "No parent should have to," George said quietly. "But here is what I learned from it, James. It is never too late to change, never too late to be honest, never too late to connect. You did that with your video. You opened yourself up in a way most people never do. That took courage. Or desperation," James said with a weak laugh. "Sometimes they are the same thing," George replied. Listen, I want to come play for you. Not for money, not because of the viral video or the pressure. I want to do it because your story reminded me why I started making music in the first place. To connect with people, to help them through the hard times, to be there when words alone are not enough. James could barely speak. You would do that? I would. But I have one condition. James's heart sank slightly. Of course there would be conditions. What is it? I do not want it to be just a performance. I want to spend time with you, James. I want to hear more of your stories. I want to meet Daniel and your grandchildren. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it right. Can you give me that? Yes, James said, his voice breaking. Yes, absolutely yes. They made plans for the following Saturday, 1 week away. George would drive up from his ranch with his band, and they would set up in James's home. No cameras, no press, no publicity. Just music and conversation, and whatever time they had. After hanging up, James sat in his study for a long time, the phone still in his hand. He felt something he had not felt in weeks, maybe years. Not quite happiness, but something in that neighborhood. A sense that despite everything, despite the cancer eating away at his pancreas and the limited time remaining on his clock, there was still beauty to be found, still moments worth experiencing. Daniel came by the next morning and found his father in better spirits than he had seen since the diagnosis. When James told him about George Strait's call, about the planned visit, Daniel's eyes welled up. Dad, that is incredible. I cannot believe he actually called you himself. Neither can I, James admitted. They were having coffee on the terrace, the early morning sun painting the hills gold. Daniel, I need to tell you something. I have been thinking a lot these past few days about the kind of father I was, about all the ways I failed you. Daniel started to protest, but James held up his hand. Let me finish. I was not there for you the way I should have been. I told myself I was building something for our family, securing our future, but the truth is I was running away from the hard work of actually being present. Your mother tried to tell me, but I did not listen. And now I'm running out of time to make it right. Dad, you do not have to. I do, James insisted, because I need you to know that my biggest regret is not the deals I did not close or the buildings I did not build. It is the soccer games I missed, the school plays, the bedtime stories I did not read. I cannot get those moments back, Daniel. They are gone forever, but I can at least acknowledge them. I can at least say I am sorry. Daniel reached across the table and took his father's hand, something he had not done since he was a small child. I forgive you, Dad. I forgave you a long time ago. I just want to spend whatever time we have left actually knowing each other. Me too, son. Me too. The week that followed was unlike any James had experienced in decades. He stopped thinking about business entirely, stopped checking stock prices and market reports. Instead, he spent his days with Daniel and his grandchildren. His grandson Tyler, who was 12, brought over his baseball glove and they tossed the ball back and forth in the backyard. James's throws getting weaker each day, but his smile growing stronger. His granddaughter Emma, who was 9, showed him her artwork and asked him questions about his childhood that no one had asked in years. And his youngest grandchild, 4-year-old Sophie, simply sat in his lap and watched cartoons, her small presence a comfort beyond words. Rebecca, Daniel's wife, came by daily with home-cooked meals, even though James could barely eat anymore. She never made him feel guilty about the appetite he had lost, just sat with him and talked about everyday things, treating him like a person rather than a dying man. It was a gift he had not known he needed. Marcus, the driver, became more than an employee during those days. He ran errands, picked up medications, and helped James move around the house when walking became difficult. But more than that, he listened. James found himself telling Marcus stories about the early days of his business, about Martha, about all the things he wished he had done differently. Marcus never judged, never offered platitudes. He just listened, and that was enough. On Wednesday, 3 days before George Strait was scheduled to arrive, James had a bad episode. The pain broke through his medication like a wave crashing through a seawall, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Daniel rushed him to the hospital, where Dr. Mitchell adjusted his medication and kept him overnight for observation. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, James wondered if he would even make it to Saturday. The cancer was progressing faster than the doctors had predicted. His body was shutting down piece by piece, and he could feel it happening. There were moments when he welcomed it, when the pain was so intense that oblivion seemed like mercy. But then he would think about George Strait driving all the way from San Antonio, about Daniel's face when he told him about the planned concert, about those mornings listening to music with his son, and he would fight a little harder. Dr. Mitchell came by on Thursday morning. "James, I am going to be honest with you. Your condition is deteriorating rapidly. If you want to make it to this concert, you need to conserve your energy. That means staying in bed, minimizing movement, letting the medication do its work." "I will do whatever it takes," James said. "I have to make it to Saturday." "I know how much this means to you," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "I have been following the story online. The whole country is rooting for you." James smiled weakly. "I still cannot believe how that video spread. I just wanted to reach one man, and somehow I reached millions." "That is the power of honesty," the doctor replied. "People recognize authentic emotion. In a world full of fake news and manufactured sentiment, your video was real. That is why it resonated." They released him on Friday morning with a new pain management protocol and strict instructions to rest. Daniel and Rebecca had prepared one of the downstairs bedrooms for him, so he would not have to navigate stairs. They had also begun setting up the great room for the concert, moving furniture to create a performance space, testing acoustics, making sure everything would be perfect. James spent Friday afternoon in that downstairs bedroom, drifting in and out of sleep, his mind wandering through memories. He thought about the first time he heard George Strait on the radio, driving home from a construction site covered in dust and exhaustion. He thought about dancing with Martha in their tiny kitchen to Amarillo by Morning, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them young and in love, and convinced they had forever. He thought about the night she died, how he had played I Cross My Heart on repeat, until Daniel finally came and sat with him in the darkness. Music had been the one constant in his life, the thread that connected all his disparate moments into something resembling a coherent story. And tomorrow, that thread would come full circle. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of perfect Texas day that felt like a gift from the universe. James woke early, helped by Daniel and Rebecca to shower and dress in clothes that hung loose on his diminished frame. He insisted on wearing the boots Martha had bought him for their 30th anniversary, even though they hurt his swollen feet. Some things mattered more than comfort. By 9 in the morning, George Strait's tour bus pulled through the gates of the estate. James watched from the window as the legendary singer stepped down, followed by 4 band members carrying instrument cases. George was 72 years old now, his hair silver under his trademark cowboy hat, but he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Daniel opened the door and greeted them warmly, shaking hands and helping carry equipment inside. James could hear voices in the entryway, the sound of laughter and instruments being unpacked. His heart was pounding so hard, he wondered if it might give out before George even started playing. Then George Strait walked into the bedroom where James waited, and suddenly all the pain, all the fear, all the grief of the past weeks seemed to lift. Here was the man whose voice had accompanied James through every significant moment of his adult life, standing in his bedroom, smiling at him with genuine warmth. "James Harrington," George said, extending his hand. "It is an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine," James managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot believe you are actually here." "Where else would I be?" George pulled up a chair and sat down next to the bed, settling in as if they were old friends rather than strangers meeting for the first time. "Now, before we do any singing, you and I are going to talk. I want to hear about Martha. I want to hear about building your empire. I want to know the man behind that video." And so they talked. Not for 5 minutes or 10, but for over 2 hours. George asked questions and James answered them, opening up in ways he never had with his therapist or his children or anyone else. There was something about George's presence, about the empathy in his eyes and the understanding in his voice, that made vulnerability feel natural rather than terrifying. George shared his own stories too. He talked about the early days of his career, playing honky-tonks for drunk cowboys who barely noticed the music. He talked about the struggle to maintain his marriage under the pressure of fame, about the guilt of being on the road when his children needed him, and he talked about Jennifer, about the phone call that shattered his world, about how he had almost quit music entirely because performing felt obscene when his daughter was gone. "But here is what I learned," George said softly. "Music is not just entertainment. It is medicine. It is connection. It is how we make sense of the things that do not make sense. Every time I step on stage, I am singing for Jennifer. I am singing for everyone who has lost someone. I am singing to remind people that they are not alone in their pain." James understood then why George had agreed to come. It was not about charity or publicity or even kindness. It was about something deeper, something fundamental about what it means to be human. We suffer alone, but we heal together. And music was one of the bridges that connected us across our isolation. "Are you ready for some songs?" George finally asked. James nodded, not trusting his voice. George helped him out of bed and into a wheelchair that Daniel had rented for the occasion. They moved slowly through the house to the great room where the band had set up a small stage area. The space looked magical, transformed by soft lighting and careful arrangement. Daniel, Rebecca, and the grandchildren were seated on couches and chairs waiting. Marcus stood near the back, a camera in his hands. "I thought you said no cameras," James said with a smile. "I said no press," George corrected, "but I figure you might want your grandchildren to remember this someday." "Marcus promised me it is just for your family." They positioned James's wheelchair front and center, close enough to the stage that he could see every detail of George's face, every movement of his fingers on the guitar strings. The band consisted of a steel guitar player, a fiddle player, a drummer, and a bass player, all veterans of countless tours who knew George's catalog inside and out. George picked up his acoustic guitar and adjusted the microphone. "James, you told me on the phone about those mornings driving through Austin with Daniel, listening to my music. You said one song in particular always stuck with you. Would that be Amarillo by Morning?" James felt tears already forming. "Yes, that was Martha's favorite." "Then that is where we will start." George's fingers found the opening chords, and suddenly the room was filled with music. Not recorded music played through speakers, but live sound, warm and immediate and perfect. When George started singing, his voice was as pure and true as it had been 40 years ago, carrying all the longing and love and loss that made country music what it was. James closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He was back in that tiny kitchen with Martha, her body pressed against his, swaying slowly to this exact song. He could smell her perfume, feel the warmth of her breath on his neck, hear her humming along slightly off-key the way she always did. The memory was so vivid that when he opened his eyes and she was not there, the grief hit him fresh and sharp, as if she had died yesterday instead of 15 years ago. But this time, the grief did not feel like drowning. It felt like remembering, like honoring, like love that had survived even death. When the song ended, there was a moment of profound silence in the room. Then Daniel started clapping, and everyone joined in, but the applause felt almost inadequate for what had just happened. George set down his guitar and walked over to James, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "You okay?" he asked softly. James nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming freely down his face. "Good tears or bad tears?" "Both," James managed. "Thank you. That was exactly what I needed." George squeezed his shoulder and returned to the stage. "This next one is called The Chair. It is about those moments when you take a chance, when you let yourself be vulnerable with someone new. James, you took that chance when you made that video. You sat in that metaphorical chair and you opened yourself up to rejection. That takes guts." The band launched into the upbeat number, and the mood in the room shifted. Tyler started tapping his foot to the rhythm, and Emma was swaying in her seat. Even little Sophie seemed captivated by the music, her eyes wide as she watched George move across the small stage. George played for 90 minutes straight, with only brief pauses between songs to share stories or take sips of water. He performed all the hits that James loved. "I Cross My Heart," "Check Yes or No," "Carrying Your Love With Me," "I Just Want to Dance With You." But he also included deeper cuts from his catalog, songs that spoke to specific moments in James's life that they had discussed during their earlier conversation. Between songs, George would talk directly to James, explaining the inspiration behind certain lyrics or sharing anecdotes from recording sessions. It felt less like a concert and more like a conversation between old friends, with music serving as the language they both understood best. During The Cowboy Rides Away, George changed some of the lyrics slightly, personalizing them for James. Instead of singing about leaving, he sang about staying present, about cherishing the time that remains. It was a subtle modification, but James caught it, and the gesture moved him deeply. Here was one of the most successful country singers in history, altering his own classic song to provide comfort to a dying stranger. Halfway through the performance, George invited Daniel to join him on stage. "James told me about those mornings you two spent driving through Austin, his son beside him, my music on the radio." "Daniel, what was your favorite song from those days?" Daniel looked startled, unprepared to be called upon. He glanced at his father, then back at George. I Can Still Make Cheyenne, I think. Dad played it constantly." "Ah, a good choice," George said, a knowing look crossing his face. "That is a song about regret, about realizing too late what matters. James, I think you and I both understand that theme pretty well." He played the song, and this time when James closed his eyes, he was in his old Ford pickup truck, Daniel Small beside him in the passenger seat, the Texas sunrise painting the sky orange and pink. His son had been maybe 7 or 8 years old, still young enough to think his father was a hero, still innocent to the ways James would disappoint him over the years to come. But Daniel was here now. His son had forgiven him, had chosen to spend these final weeks at his side. That had to count for something. That had to mean that despite all his failures, James had not completely ruined the most important relationship in his life. When the song ended, George did something unexpected. He handed his guitar to one of the band members and stepped down from the stage. He walked over to where Rebecca was sitting with the grandchildren and knelt in front of Tyler. "Young man, your grandfather tells me you play baseball. Is that right?" Tyler nodded shyly. "Yes, sir. I am a pitcher. A pitcher. That is a position that requires a lot of heart, a lot of courage. You know what else requires heart and courage? Family. Being there for the people you love even when it is hard. Your grandfather wishes he had been there for your dad the way your dad is being there for him now. You are lucky to have a father who learned from those mistakes. Do not take that for granted, okay?" "I won't," Tyler said seriously. George stood and looked at Emma. "And you, young lady, your grandfather tells me you are an artist." Emma beamed. "I like to draw and paint." "Art is important," George said. "It is how we make sense of the world, how we express things we cannot say with words. Keep creating, Emma. The world needs more beauty in it." Finally, he turned to little Sophie, who was watching him with wide eyes. "And you, sweetheart, you might not remember this day when you grow up, but I want you to know something. Your great-grandfather is one of the bravest men I have ever met. He is teaching all of us how to face the end with dignity and grace. That is a powerful lesson." He returned to the stage and picked up his guitar again. This next song is called "Love Without End, Amen." It is about a father's love for his son, about forgiveness and acceptance and the bonds that tie families together across generations. James, this one is for you and Daniel. As George sang, James watched his son's face. Daniel was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. Rebecca had her arm around him, holding him close. The grandchildren were quiet, sensing the weight of the moment, even if they could not fully understand it. The lyrics spoke of a father telling his son that his love would never end, that no matter what mistakes were made or what disappointments occurred, the bond between them was unbreakable. James had never said those words to Daniel, had never been able to articulate what he felt, but George Strait was saying them for him now, giving voice to emotions James had kept locked inside for too long. When the song finished, Daniel got up from his seat and walked over to his father's wheelchair. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around James, holding him tight. "I love you, Dad," Daniel whispered. "I have always loved you." "I love you too, son," James replied, his voice breaking. "I am so sorry I did not say it more. You are saying it now, that is what matters." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and son, holding each other while George and the band quietly played instrumental music in the background. It was a moment of pure healing, of wounds being acknowledged if not completely closed, of love being spoken after too many years of silence. Eventually, Daniel returned to his seat, and George addressed the room. "I have been making music for over 50 years now. I have played stadiums and arenas, festivals and award shows, but I can honestly say that this right here, in this room with this family, is one of the most meaningful performances of my entire career. Music is not about how many people are watching. It is about connection. It is about being present for the moments that matter." He looked directly at James. "You asked in your video why my music meant so much to you. I think I understand now. It is because music fills the spaces between words. It says the things we cannot say ourselves. It reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles, that someone else has felt what we feel, And when we are facing our darkest moments, that reminder can be everything. George played a few more songs, his voice never wavering, his presence never diminishing. He performed "I Saw God Today," a song about recognizing divinity in everyday moments, about finding grace in unexpected places. He sang "The Best Day," a nostalgic reflection on childhood memories and the passage of time. And he closed with "Troubadour," a song about the enduring power of music to sustain us through life's journey. As the final notes faded, the room erupted in applause. But George held up his hand, silencing everyone. "Before we finish, I want to do one more thing. James, you talked about Martha, about how much she meant to you, about how much you miss her. I lost someone too, my daughter Jennifer. She was 13 when she died, and not a day goes by that I do not think about her. Grief is something we carry forever. It does not get lighter, but we get stronger at bearing it. I wrote a song years ago that I rarely perform. It is called Baby Blue, and it is about loss and memory and the way love persists even when the person is gone. I would like to play it now, for Martha and for Jennifer, and for everyone we have loved and lost." The song was haunting and beautiful, stripped down to just George's voice and guitar. It spoke of empty rooms and phantom touches, of hearing someone's laughter in the wind, of learning to live with an absence that never quite fades. As he sang, James felt something shift inside him. The grief he had carried for Martha, the guilt about Daniel, the fear of his own approaching death, all of it seemed to coalesce into something bearable. Not gone, but integrated. Part of his story rather than the whole of it. When George finished, he set down his guitar and walked over to James one final time. "Thank you for letting me be here today. Thank you for reminding me why I do this. You gave me a gift, James, even though you thought you were asking for one." "No," James said firmly, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Thank you. This was more than I ever dreamed it could be. You did not just play music for me. You understood what I needed before I even knew myself." George smiled. "That is what the good songs do. They know us better than we know ourselves." The band began packing up their equipment, and Rebecca brought out food she had prepared for everyone. George and his musicians stayed for another hour, eating and talking with the family, treating them not as fans, but as friends. George sat with Tyler and gave him advice about baseball, about staying focused and working hard. He looked through Emma's sketchbook and praised her talent genuinely. He even let Sophie wear his cowboy hat for photographs. As the afternoon light began to fade, George finally said his goodbyes. But before leaving, he pulled Daniel aside. "Your father is a remarkable man," George said quietly, "but you probably know that by now. These last few weeks, the way you have shown up for him, that is love in action. That is what matters when the music stops and the lights go down. We do not remember the deals people made or the money they earned. We remember how they made us feel, whether they were there when we needed them." "Thank you for today," Daniel said. "I do not know how to repay you for this." "You do not repay gifts," George replied. "You pass them forward. Be present for your kids the way you have been present for your father. Break the cycle. That is payment enough." George returned to James, who was back in his wheelchair, exhausted but radiant. "James Harrington, it has been an honor." "The honor was mine, George, truly." They shook hands, then George bent down and embraced the older man gently. "You are going to be okay," he whispered. "Whatever comes next, you are going to be okay." After George and his band left, after the equipment was packed away and the great room returned to normal, James sat on the terrace with Daniel, watching the sun set over the Texas hills. The pain medication was wearing off, and he could feel the cancer reasserting itself in his body, but he did not care. For a few hours he had been free from it. For a few hours he had experienced pure joy. "That was the most incredible day of my life," James said softly. Daniel took his father's hand. "Mine too, Dad. Mine too." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the lights of Austin twinkling in the distance. James felt a profound sense of peace settling over him, something he had not experienced since before Martha's death. The concert had given him more than music. It had given him closure, connection, and the knowledge that his life, despite its flaws and failures, had mattered. The days following the concert were different from the ones before. James's physical condition continued to deteriorate, the cancer advancing with relentless efficiency, but his spirit seemed paradoxically stronger. He spent his mornings on the terrace when the weather permitted, afternoons with his grandchildren, and evenings talking with Daniel about everything they had never discussed before. Tyler came by after school most days, sometimes bringing his homework to do at his grandfather's bedside. James would help when he could, though his mind was often foggy from medication. But Tyler did not seem to mind. He just wanted to be there, to soak up whatever time remained. "Grandpa," Tyler asked one afternoon, "are you scared?" James considered the question carefully. A month ago he would have lied, would have put on the brave face he had worn his entire life. But George Strait's visit had stripped away his need for pretense. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly I am scared of pain, of losing my dignity at the end. But I am not scared of death itself anymore. I think that is what Saturday gave me. A reminder that life is not measured in years, but in moments. And I have had some beautiful moments." Tyler nodded solemnly. "Like the concert?" "Like the concert. And like right now, sitting here with you." Emma brought him a drawing she had made of George Strait performing in their great room. It was remarkably good for a 9-year-old, capturing not just the physical details but the emotion of the moment. James had it framed and hung on the wall across from his bed, so it was the first thing he saw every morning. Little Sophie, too young to understand death, would climb into bed with him, and they would watch cartoons together. Her innocent presence was a balm, a reminder that life continued in cycles, that his ending was part of something larger and ongoing. Rebecca proved to be an unexpected source of comfort during those final weeks. She had always been kind to James, but there had been a distance between them, a formality born from his own inability to be warm with people. Now that formality dissolved. She would sit with him for hours, reading aloud from books he had always meant to read but never had time for. Her voice became as familiar and soothing as music. Marcus continued to be indispensable, but their relationship had transformed completely. The driver who had once maintained professional distance now sat with James like a son, sharing stories about his own father's death, about his fears and hopes. James learned that Marcus was saving money to go back to school, that he dreamed of becoming a teacher. In a gesture that surprised even himself, James quietly arranged for Marcus's tuition to be paid in full, a gift that would only be revealed after his death. 2 weeks after the concert, James received an unexpected phone call. It was George Strait. "James, I have been thinking about you constantly since that Saturday. How are you holding up?" "I am still here," James said with a weak laugh. "Thanks to you, I think. That day gave me something to hold on to." "I am glad. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. My next show is in San Antonio, 3 weeks from now. I know travel is probably difficult for you, but I wondered if you and your family might want to come. I would love to have you there to introduce you to the crowd." James's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of navigating an arena full of people in his condition seemed impossible. But then he thought about those mornings with Daniel, about the music that had sustained him through his darkest times, about the gift George had already given him. "I will try," James promised. "I cannot guarantee I will make it that long or that I will be strong enough, but I will try." "That is all any of us can do," George replied. The next 3 weeks were a race against time. James's body was failing rapidly now. He had lost over 40 pounds. His skin had taken on a grey pallor, and there were days when he could barely stay conscious for more than a few hours. Dr. Mitchell was frank about the prognosis. "James, I do not think you should attempt this trip. The physical strain alone could kill you." "Then I will die having tried," James said stubbornly. "Doctor, I have 3 weeks at most anyway, maybe less. If I die in that arena listening to music I love, surrounded by my family, is that really worse than dying in this bed?" Dr. Mitchell sighed but did not argue further. He adjusted James's medication to maximize his energy for the concert date, knowing it would likely cost him days on the back end. It was a devil's bargain, but James accepted it without hesitation. As the date approached, James found himself thinking not about death, but about legacy. What would people remember about James Harrington? The buildings he constructed, the fortune he amassed. He hoped they would remember this too, these final weeks when he had finally learned what mattered. One evening, with Daniel sitting beside him, James made a request. "I want to record something, a message for the grandchildren for when they are older, and I am just a faded memory." Daniel set up his phone, and James began to speak. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "Tyler, Emma, Sophie, by the time you see this, I will be gone, but I want you to know some things. First, your father is a better man than I ever was. He learned from my mistakes, and he shows up for you in ways I never showed up for him. Honor that. Appreciate it. Tell him you love him, because time runs out faster than you think. Second, do not measure success by money or power or status. I did that my whole life, and at the end, none of it mattered. What mattered was the mornings in the truck with your dad, the dance in the kitchen with your grandmother, the afternoon a stranger came to sing for me because I asked honestly for help. Those moments, those connections, that is what makes a life meaningful. And third, when you are facing your own hard times, and you will, remember that asking for help is not weakness, it is courage. I spent 78 years trying to be strong alone, and I was miserable. The last few weeks when I finally let people in were the happiest of my life. Do not make my mistake. Let people love you. Let yourself love them back. He paused, exhausted from the effort of speaking. I love you all. I wish I had more time to show you how much, but I trust your father will do that for me. Daniel turned off the camera, tears streaming down his face. Dad, that was beautiful. It was true, James replied. That is all I have left now. The truth. The night before the concert, James barely slept. His body was in agony despite the medication, and he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake trying to push himself this far. But every time he considered giving up, he thought about George Strait making the drive to Austin, about the gift of that Saturday afternoon, about the chance to experience live music one more time in an arena full of people who loved it as much as he did. Morning came with typical Texas heat. Daniel and Rebecca had arranged for a medical transport van to take James to San Antonio, complete with a nurse to monitor his vitals during the 2-hour drive. Marcus would drive Daniel and the children separately. The whole family was coming, determined to be there for whatever happened. The drive was grueling. Every bump in the road sent shockwaves of pain through James's body. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally waking to find the nurse checking his pulse or adjusting his medication, but he made it to San Antonio. He made it to the arena. George had arranged for them to enter through a private entrance to avoid the crowds and chaos of the main gates. A wheelchair was waiting, along with George himself, who had left his pre-show preparation to greet them personally. James, George said, kneeling beside the wheelchair, you made it. I was not sure you would. Neither was I, James admitted. His voice was barely a whisper now. But I had to try. I had to be here. I am honored, George said simply. Come on, let me show you where you will be watching from. They had set up a special area for James and his family, not in the general seating but in a private box with comfortable furniture, climate control, and easy access for medical equipment. It was perfect, allowing James to be part of the experience without being overwhelmed by it. As the arena filled with people, as the energy built toward showtime, James felt something he had not felt in months: anticipation, joy, the simple pleasure of being alive to witness something beautiful. The lights went down, the crowd roared, and George Strait walked onto that stage like he had 1,000 times before, his presence commanding, his smile genuine. The band launched into the opening number, and 20,000 people sang along. James watched, transfixed. This was different from the intimate concert in his great room, but it was magnificent in its own way. The collective energy of all these people, united in their love of music, the power of a voice that could fill an arena and still sound intimate, the magic of live performance on a grand scale. Midway through the show, George paused between songs. I want to tell you all about someone special here tonight. A few weeks ago, I met a man named James Harrington. Some of you might have seen his video online, the one where he talked about his final wish to hear me sing. Well, I had the privilege of performing for James at his home, and tonight he is here with us despite being very sick. James, can we get a light on you? A spotlight found James in his private box. The crowd erupted in applause, 20,000 people standing to honor a stranger they had come to care about through his viral video. James was overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face as he weakly raised his hand in acknowledgement. James reminded me why I do this, George continued. Not for the fame or the money or the awards. I do this because music heals. It connects us. It helps us survive the unsurvivable. So this next song is for James, and for everyone out there who is fighting their own battle, who is facing their own darkness. This is I Cross My Heart. As George sang the romantic ballad, Daniel put his arm around his father's shoulders. Rebecca held Emma and Sophie close. Tyler stood tall, trying to be strong for his grandfather, and James felt a completeness he had never known before. His family surrounding him, music filling the air, thousands of people sharing this moment with him. The concert continued for another hour. George played all the hits, the crowd sang along to every word, and James absorbed it all, knowing these would likely be his final hours of true consciousness. The cancer was winning. He could feel his body shutting down, systems failing one by one. But he was here. He had made it. He had done the impossible. After the final encore, after the crowd had filed out and the arena had grown quiet, George came to the private box. He looked exhausted but happy, the way performers do after giving everything to their art. "Thank you for being here," he said to James. "Thank you for reminding me what this is all about." "Thank you for giving me this," James replied, his voice barely audible now. "Both times. You gave me more than music, George. You gave me peace." They embraced one final time. Two men from different worlds united by their shared humanity, by their losses and loves, and the understanding that life's meaning is found not in what we accumulate, but in how we connect. The drive back to Austin that night was somber. James slipped into unconsciousness shortly after leaving the arena and never fully woke again. The nurse monitored him constantly, adjusting medications, checking vitals, knowing that the end was approaching rapidly. They made it home just before dawn. Daniel and Marcus carefully transferred James from the van to his bed, arranging him comfortably with pillows and blankets. Dr. Mitchell arrived an hour later, took one look at his patient, and knew it would be today. "Is he in pain?" Daniel asked. "No," the doctor assured him. "The medication is keeping him comfortable. He is just tired. His body is ready to let go." The family gathered throughout the morning. Rebecca brought the children, explaining gently that Grandpa was going to heaven soon, that they should say their goodbyes. Tyler held his grandfather's hand and whispered his thanks for their conversations. Emma placed her drawing of the concert on the bed beside him. Sophie kissed his cheek and told him she loved him, not really understanding but knowing it was important. Daniel sat beside his father all day, holding his hand, occasionally speaking, even though James could not respond. "Thank you for these last weeks, Dad. Thank you for finally letting me in. Thank you for showing me that it is never too late to change, never too late to love. I forgive you for everything. I hope you can forgive yourself." As evening approached, as the Texas sun began its descent toward the horizon, George Strait's voice suddenly filled the room. Marcus had set up speakers and was playing Amarillo by Morning, the song that had started everything that Saturday afternoon weeks ago. James's breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, seemed to steady with the music. His face, tight with the invisible strain of dying, relaxed slightly. Daniel watched his father's expression and understood that even now, even at the very edge of consciousness, the music was reaching him. They played George's songs for the next 2 hours. Every ballad, every love song, every anthem of heartache and hope that had been the soundtrack to James Harrington's life. The family sat in quiet vigil, letting the music speak what words could not. "As I Cross My Heart" played for the final time, as George's voice filled the room with promises of eternal love and unbreakable bonds, James Harrington took one last breath and was still. Daniel felt his father's hand go limp in his own. He looked up at Dr. Mitchell, who checked for a pulse and then nodded gently. It was over. James was gone. But he had not died alone in a sterile hospital bed, surrounded by machines and strangers. He had died at home, surrounded by family and music, having spent his final weeks truly living for the first time in decades. He had died having made peace with his son, having created memories his grandchildren would treasure forever, having learned that vulnerability is strength and connection is everything. The funeral was held 1 week later at a small chapel in Austin. To everyone's surprise, George Strait attended, sitting quietly in the back row. When the service concluded, he approached Daniel. "Your father was a remarkable man," George said. "He taught me something important, that every life, no matter how successful or flawed, has value. That it is never too late to change course, that asking for help is an act of courage, not weakness." "He would have been honored to know you came," Daniel replied. "I would not have missed it. James gave me a gift when he made that video. He reminded me why my music matters. I will carry that with me for whatever years I have left." In the weeks and months that followed, Daniel found himself returning to the video James had recorded for the grandchildren, listening to his father's final wisdom. He made changes in his own life, spending less time at the office and more time at baseball games and art shows. He took Rebecca on dates and actually paid attention. He told his children he loved them every single day. The story of James Harrington and George Strait lived on beyond them both. The video of James's original request, combined with news coverage of the concerts and eventually James's death, became a cultural touchstone. It was shared millions of times, discussed on talk shows and podcasts, cited in articles about what matters at the end of life. But for Daniel and his family, the story was more personal. It was about a man who spent most of his life chasing the wrong things and then, in his final weeks, discovered what had been there all along. Love, connection, music, family. The simple, profound truths that give life meaning. Tyler grew up to be not just a talented pitcher, but a compassionate man who volunteered with hospice patients, inspired by his grandfather's final journey. Emma became an artist whose work explored themes of mortality and redemption, her breakthrough painting a portrait of an old man listening to music with tears of joy on his face. And Sophie, who had been too young to remember much, grew up hearing stories about the grandfather who taught their family how to live by learning how to die. Marcus finished his teaching degree and became an educator who specialized in helping at-risk youth, funded by the scholarship James had secretly arranged. He never forgot the man who had seen beyond their employer-employee relationship to recognize his potential. And sometimes, late at night, when Daniel needed to feel close to his father, he would pour a glass of bourbon, sit on that same terrace where they had watched the sunset together, and play George Strait's music. In those moments, James felt present, not as a ghost, but as a memory made tangible by melody and lyric. The story of what George Strait did for a dying millionaire became legend, but those who knew the truth understood it was so much more. It was a story about human connection, transcending fame and fortune, about art serving its highest purpose, to heal, to unite, to remind us that we are all fighting battles and all deserving of compassion, about a singer who could have stayed on his ranch and ignored a stranger's plea, but chose instead to show up with his whole heart. Most of all, it was a story about a man named James Harrington, who spent 78 years building an empire and 3 months building a legacy, who learned in his final act that the greatest wealth is not what we accumulate, but what we give away. Not the walls we construct, but the bridges we build. Not the silence we maintain, but the truths we finally speak. The last wish of a condemned man became a gift to everyone who heard about it. A reminder that it is never too late to ask for what you need, never too late to be honest, never too late to love and be loved in return. And in the end, that was worth more than all the billions James had ever made.